It's the Opperman Report. And now, here is investigator Ed Opperman.
Okay, welcome to the Opperman Report. I'm your host, private investigator Ed Opperman. Now, you can find me at Opperman Investigations and Digital Forensic Consulting if you just email me directly at oppermaninvestigations@gmail.com. Really excited about today's show. We have Sean Howe. You can find him at Twitter at Sean Howe, and that's Howe. Now, you could find him on his website is SeanHowe.com. The book we're talking about today is Agents of Chaos, Thomas King Forçade, High Times and the Paranoid End of the 70s. I read a chapter of this book in the Rolling Stone. It's an excellent book. This guy's an excellent writer. He captures the time. As you know, I have some connections to this story. But Sean Howe, are you there?
I'm here.
Hey, man, thank you so much. Before we get into your book, Agents of Chaos, Thomas King Forçade, tell us about yourself. Who is Sean Howe?
Yeah, sure. I'm a writer in my 40s. I wrote a book before this called Marvel Comics: The Untold Story. And when I finished that book, I thought that was kind of a big, wide-ranging history. Maybe I'll bite off a little less this time. And it turned out that this book took me about 4 times as long to write. Yeah. So I'm emerging from hibernation with this book.
And how's the book been received? Because from my perspective, you know, like growing up in that time in that neighborhood, I think, boy, we were such obscure people. Like, who would even want to read about us? Back then, we thought we were nobodies, you know? And now to have a guy write a book about this, like it's history, you know? Like, how's the book being received?
It's getting really nice reviews. People are telling me they love it. It's just come out. There was an excerpt in Rolling Stone. There was an excerpt in Reason magazine.
Oh, really?
So trying to reach all the different political polls that I can. And it's been really terrific talking to people who were there. I spoke to a lot of people for the book, but I'm now getting a few stories that I had never heard before, and it's great to hear people say like this really takes me back to what it was like.
Yeah, I heard about the book through TrueAnon, because I subscribe to their, they send me their, I guess I'm on their mailing list or something. I heard about it that way. And it's really rare for me to find a guest on another show and say, hey, let me interview that guest, but I just love this topic. Now, people can meet Sean Howe in person if they go to the October 2nd at 7 p.m. in Los Angeles at the Stories Book and Cafe. And also to October 6th. He's going to be driving around, this guy, or flying, I guess. October 6th at 6:30 p.m. in Phoenix, Arizona, the Changing Hands Bookstore. Are you flying or driving?
I think I'm going to fly, although it would be a really nice drive. Just that way I can stay in Los Angeles a little bit longer and see some friends.
It is a nice drive. You clear your head out in those deserts, man. I love that drive. I spent a lot of time.
I have made the drive.
Like Tom Forçade, I spent a lot of time in Arizona myself. All right, let's start with this, man. So the book is mainly about Tom Forçade or all the yippies?
I would say it's mainly about Forçade, but, I came across his story, or I came across the outlines of his story, and I was like, who is this guy that I've never heard of that seems to have had a hand in so many different subcultures, from the Underground Press to, major magazine of the 1970s, High Times, the punk rock movement. He was very active in fighting for journalists' rights. And yet, I'm interested in all of these things, but I had never heard his name. And the more I learned about him, the more intrigued I was, because he was such a man of mystery. So there would be these adventures that he would pop up in, and, he would be, alongside Hunter S. Thompson or Johnny Rotten. But there was also so much that was kind of under a veil about him. And as I kept finding out more about him, I realized, he might be a good way to talk about the 1970s in a larger spectrum. And there's kind of this story of the 1970s that kind of skips from, Altamont was the death of the 60s, and then we had Watergate, and we had gas lines, and then Reagan came along. And there's really not much to connect the 60s and the 80s. And so I wanted to sort of maybe fill in some of the gaps of that history.
Yeah, and what a time to live in New York, man, during that period of time. And Chelsea Hotel, and Lower East Side with CBGBs, all that stuff, man. But it's fascinating, too, because, Tom Forçade tragically took his life the day before Jonestown.
Right. So there were, people I spoke to who remember those two events, finding out about Tom's death and hearing about Jonestown on the radio. And it was, I think, a week before Harvey Milk was killed. So there was this convergence of really terrible news, and a lot of it was, you could say that all of these things were sort of ends of eras in a way. 1978 seemed to me like, the final end of the 60s in a way.
Yeah. So tell us, who was Tom Forçade? Tell us about this man.
So the guy that we know as Tom Forçade just kind of emerged on the radical scene at the end of the 60s when there was a lot of factionalism going on. SDS was splitting into different camps. SNCC had split up into different camps. Underground newspapers were kind of fighting with each other over who was more of a sellout. And this is, of course, just after Chicago 1968. So, the left and the center left are really also at odds. And Forçade comes on the scene, and he immediately arouses suspicion from everyone. I open with a scene in Buffalo at a drug symposium, and Timothy Leary and Abby Hoffman and the MC5, Allen Ginsberg, all these people are in this hotel room, and Forçade, comes into the room, throws a gun on the bed, and announces that he's the head of the Underground Press Syndicate. And the way that I heard the story was everybody kind of turned to each other and said, "Uh-oh, this guy's an agent." And that's kind of the amount of suspicion that was normal that he would arouse. So even as he took over running, the Underground Press Syndicate was this organization that coordinated between all of the different underground newspapers around the country. And so he was kind of in a position to manage all of this stuff. And he was traveling around the country, meeting people at different underground newspapers. And he was kind of insinuating himself with the leadership of the anti-war movement, the countercultural movement. But a lot of people just did not trust the guy, kept him at an arm's length, but he still was kind of, accruing power and influence.
Let me ask you a quick question.
Yeah.
You tell the story about him walking into the room, throwing the gun down, but it seems like everyone else in that room is dead. Every other name you mentioned, Larry, they're all gone now. Abby Hoffman, they're all dead. Who told you that story?
That story came from someone who is no longer alive. That was an interview that Ken Kelly, who was a White Panther,
right,
and then later a kind of a prominent journalist for Playboy and other places. Ken Kelly told that story, and he, was remembering. He was one of the people who was especially suspicious of Forçade, a lot of this, this story had to be told through archival materials. I talked to, I think, more than 150 people, and yet so much of the information also came from, microfilmed underground newspapers, and also some interviews that people before me had done. There were about 3 people who had tried to do a book about Forçade over the years, and none of those were ever finished. Some were barely started. So it was a lot of, hearing the voices of people who are no longer around. And, thankfully there were records of these conversations.
Now, who were your sources? Did you talk to people like A.J. Weberman?
Yeah, I talked to a lot of the Zippies, who, your listeners may or may not know were sort of an offshoot of the original Yippies. They were kind of formed in opposition to what they believed was the selling out of Jerry Rubin and Abby Hoffman. Mm-hmm. They thought that the Yippies had gone too mainstream, gotten too cozy with the establishment. And so these Zippies like A.J. Weberman, Dana Beal, Aaron Kay, they were sort of, more outrageous than the Yippies had been. And I spend quite a bit of time talking in the book about the confrontations between those two groups at the presidential conventions of 1972. The Democrats and the Republicans both held their conventions in Miami, so there was a whole summer of fighting between the groups. So I talked to a lot of Zippies. I talked to a lot of people at High Times. I talked to people in the underground press world. I talked to some people who had smuggled drugs with Forçade, and even talked to a couple police undercover agents. So much like Tom Forçade really compartmentalized his life, and so I had about a dozen different groups of people that I had to talk to individually, because each of them only knew, part of the story.
Richard Stratton?
I spoke to him a little bit early on, yeah.
Okay.
He was involved in some smuggling as well, and then later, of course, became involved in High Times.
Oh, my goodness, smuggling. Okay. Now, what about Steve Hager? What about it? Did he contribute? Because he seems to feel he's the keeper of the Tom Forçade story. Did he cooperate?
I've spoken to Steve Hager, but I really was concentrating on people who knew Forçade or were kind of around at the time. Forçade died in 1978, so there are a lot of people who are maybe 1 degree removed from Forçade, right, and who also have really contributed to kind of the legend of Tom Forçade, keeping that alive. But I wanted to get as many direct experience stories as I could. John Holmstrom is another person who he had done a great deal of research in writing articles on Forçade. John Holmstrom, the co-founder of Punk magazine, and later a High Times editor, and he had some tremendous stories about traveling on the Sex Pistols American tour with Forçade. Although traveling in separate transportation, because Forçade, needed to keep his distance, his mystery.
Now, you mentioned off the air, we were talking briefly about Dana Beal, who was the head of the Yippies when I was around there. You mentioned that Dana Beal showed up at one of your book signings and kind of not unlike Dana Beal, commandeered the microphone and took over.
Right.
Yeah. How did he receive your book?
I don't think that he has read it.
Right.
I offered to give him a copy of the book after the reading, and he said he was interested, and he said another time. So he actually sent me his address. So I will be sending him a copy of the book. He certainly plays a big enough role in the book, and he was helpful in connecting some stories for me. But I was thrilled before we started recording that you were saying that you were kind of exposed